someone is pointing their fovea at you. We can detect what would you call it? Deviation from direct gaze with an accuracy that's absolutely remarkable. Now each of those little cells in the fovea is connected, each of the one cells is connected to like 20,000 cells at the first level of the hierarchy of the visual system. And so the reason that your whole eye isn't fovea is because your head would have to be this big to manage it. So, you know, what's evolved is sort of a compromise, is that in the center of your vision, the center of your vision is very, very detailed. And then what you do is you zip that center around, like snap, 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 and your brain sort of makes a amalgamated picture out of all those little snapshots. And, you know, then it weaves it together so it seems to you like it's a continuous, a continuous movie of consciousness, even though it's really not. And then the sides of your eyes, the periphery of your eyes, well, they don't have the same potency as the fovea. And so they kind of play a triage game. It's like, okay, I can't see, if I'm looking straight ahead, I can't see everything. What might I use as an indication that I should move my gaze from where I'm looking to somewhere else? And one answer to that is movement. So the periphery is pretty good at picking up movement. And so often if you see movement in the periphery, then you'll move your foveal vision to where the movement was, and then, you know, then you can keep track of what's changing. So what your brain sort of assumes is that when you're looking at something, everything else is irrelevant, and it also sort of fades into the background. And so that's what's happening with the gorilla video. And so part of the reason you can't see the damn gorilla is because he's dressed in black like the players. And so when you're focusing on the basketball, all the black moving things look the same. You know, there's no distinction between them at all. And then the background of the curtain, it's like, well, first of all, why would you be primed to see the curtain change color? Like, things just don't do that in real life, right? I mean, big objects don't suddenly change color, or very, very seldomly. So, and more importantly, the fact that the gorilla shows up, the fact that one player leaves, and the fact that the curtains change color has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not you can complete the task, right? So it doesn't matter if you ignore the information, and that's because it's irrelevant in terms of the interpretive frame, the motivated interpretive frame that you're applying to the scene. And so the rule for perception is don't pay attention to anything that isn't directly relevant to the desired outcome. Now, exactly how you calculate what you can pay attention to and what you can't, that's very complicated. I mean, you build that knowledge bit by bit over time, and you can be wrong about it too. But so the old idea was, you know, well, first of all, that you were very much conscious of the environment, period, which you're not. And then the second idea was, well, while you're being conscious of the environment, if anything changes radically, you will definitely focus your attention on it. And what turned out to be the case is, well, you're not very conscious of the environment, and radical things can happen, and you won't notice them unless they interfere with what you're doing. So something that emerges, that interferes with what you're doing, that you don't expect, you will instantly orient towards and concentrate on. So it isn't anomaly or novelty that attracts your attention. It's the unexpected disruption of the relationship between your behaviors and the desired outcome of those behaviors. And that's a much narrower claim. Only pay attention to things that make you fail. It's something like that. Or at least additionally pay attention to things that make you fail. And, you know, generally speaking, that's also associated with an emotional response, you know. So if you're doing something and you know, you think you know how to do it, and so you're doing it, and then all of a sudden something unexpected happens, you're going to have an emotional reaction. And we'll talk more about the emotional reactions in the next class, but the emotional reaction partly prepares you for the worst in case this unexpected thing is bigger than you think it is, and sort of also primes you to be curious and to start to explore, to figure out what it is, so that you can reconstruct your expectations and desires in accordance with the transforming world. So this slide is an elaboration in some sense of what I was telling you a little bit earlier about the multiple levels of reality, you know. So the idea is that the thing that you see, which in this particular schema would be the computer, is nested inside all of these systems, or has other systems nested inside of it. And that's part of an indication of the complexity of things. Now, you know, one of the things that you might think about, for example, if you're using your computer, one of the things you might ask yourself is like, why is your computer a black rectangle or like a silver rectangle? It's all smooth and shiny. Why is that? You know, like, it's not clear first, it's not transparent, okay, and then it's got this smooth cover, and it wouldn't necessarily have to. Why do you think that's appealing to you?
Because it's familiar for like a book.
Okay, so it's familiar, yeah, and that's good, so it's familiar. What else is, it's simple. Yeah, you don't want to interact with the computer at all. You want to interact with little pictures on the screen. And then you don't even really want to interact with those. You want to interact with some subset of what that picture is doing on the screen. And so you're very, very rarely using the computer, right? You're just paying attention to, well, let's say the screen and the keyboard. So the computer is whatever's underneath that. And then what that is a collection of parts that are so bloody complicated that you don't want to have anything to do with them, that are nested inside a whole network of things that are so complex you don't want to have anything to do with them. And so you know, what happens when you're using a computer is all of a sudden it stops working. Well, then it's a computer. As soon as it stops working, it's a computer. Before that, it was whatever it was you were doing. And as soon as it turns into a computer, what do you do with it? Well, you know, you stupidly hit the on and off button, and maybe you plug it in and you know, and out or something. And maybe you check your switches to make sure that a fuse didn't burn out or a breaker go, and that's pretty much the end of you in terms of your ability to deal with the actual entity. You know, and then you curse with your primate brain, and then you send it out to be fixed. And so one of the things that's worth considering, because this will also help us understand what happens in terms of brain function as we go along, is that as long as things are going according to how you want them to go, you can really pretend that the world is unbelievably simple. All the world consists of is those few things that you're doing in your little bounded perceptual frame. And everything else is zero. And then, unfortunately, now and then, the hypothesis that everything else is zero is radically wrong, like when your computer crashes. And then you actually, for a while, have to deal with at least some of the complexity that's actually there. And that's usually extremely anxiety-provoking. So, you know, you can imagine the same situation is while you're in your nice smooth car and you're on the highway, and all of a sudden, you know, you hear a horrible grinding noise and smoke comes out of the back and you're pulled over to the side. Well, what was merely a means of getting from point A to B in comfort, like 2 seconds ago, is now a collection of extremely troublesome parts, none of which you know anything about, plus it's disrupted your day, plus it's disrupted your pocketbook, plus you have to now deal with a bunch of people who are going to tell you what's wrong with your vehicle and maybe fix it for some completely unknown amount of money and with dubious utility. And so poof, the car turns into that. And so it's almost impossible to overestimate the degree to which we live within a world that's bounded by our expectations and desires, and how much time we spend keeping everything that's complex away from us so that we don't have to deal with it. Okay, so now we might want to think about how we do that. I'm going to show you, this is a little schema that might be helpful. So, like, I made this little diagram of dots because I wanted to make an ambiguous figure. So, I'm hoping that when you look at that figure, what do you see when you look at it? The center. And what shape is the center? A cross. Okay, so you can see a cross. What else can you see? It's a rectangle. Yeah, what else can you see?
4 squares.
It's 4 squares. Yeah, exactly. So, and what else can you see?
18 triangles within those 4 squares. Made up of dots.
That's a good one. I haven't seen that one. I'll take your word for it, though. What else can you see? Well, I'll show you some of the things you can see, okay? You see that, right? You see that? See that? You can see that. You can see that. Okay, so the first thing that you might note is that the thing in the beginning, the thing in itself, let's say, you can see multiple ways. It's not exactly that you have an opinion about what it is. You know, it's that you can actually see those different things. You can see it manifesting those different perceptual objects. And that's a strange thing, because you know how people always think that arguments are about opinions. There's some facts, and you have one set of opinions about them, and you have another, and then you argue about the opinions till you get to the facts. Unfortunately, it's a lot worse than that, because the facts themselves are often reasonably subject to debate. So you might ask, for example, which of the 5 ways that you could see that initial thing is the right way to see it? And the answer to that, and this is a pragmatic answer, is it depends on what you want to do with your perception. You know, so if you want the highest resolution that captures as much detail as possible, then you want something as close to the thing in itself as possible. So that'd probably be object 5 there. You know, if you want to know the rough area, let's say that's a map of an orchard, you might think about object 1. If it's an orchard from the top, right, and you want it to walk from north to south, you might want to think about it in terms of object 3. You know, and so those are different ways you can perceive that object. And then I would say that what happens at the next level of abstraction, and that's where you've got the numbers and words down here, is that you have the thing in itself, which is complex and can be seen many ways. Then you have the things you see, which are partial, sort of low resolution representations of the thing itself. And then there are words which are, at least in part, references to the image of the thing. And so by the time you get to the word, it's pretty compressed. And I really like the metaphor of compression, you know, so, because a lot of the things you see are sort of like thumbnails. And why are thumbnails useful? You guys have done some, you know, image processing, say. Like, obviously a thumbnail lacks some things that a 16 megabyte, is that about right now? How big are cameras? 16 megabytes for a single photo? What's that? Yeah, well, I think the new cameras are up, I think they're up to 16, the newest iteration. So, okay, so why have thumbnail if you have a 16 megabyte picture? Okay, but why not use the picture? Because then it takes more time. Right, that's exactly it. Is that there's a trade-off between detailed representation and time utilization, time and resource utilization. And you know, like a computer, you guys have limited time and resources, and so you don't actually want to see any more than you need to see in order to get what you're supposed to get done. Because otherwise it's just a waste of energy. And so what that means is that your brain is always trying to figure out, in some sense, what's the simplest way I can represent this so that I can undertake whatever it is that I'm planning to undertake next. And that's sort of, again, from a philosophical perspective, that's actually something pragmatic. Okay, so then you might ask yourself, you organize your perceptions in relationship to your goals, and then you might ask yourself, well, where do those goals come from? You know, and we've heard from thinkers like, say, Freud, who talked about the id functions, and the id is sort of the seat of primordial impulses, right? And so you might think about the id as the producer of primary goals or drives, and Freud did think about them as drives, so they were things that led to, you know, a relatively rigid behavioral algorithm once the state had arisen. Now, as I mentioned before, I think that that's a flawed viewpoint, because the motivational state is more than merely a drive, because a drive is something that, say, triggers a pre-programmed sequence of behaviors. And a lot of the early behaviorists thought about animal behavior in that way, right? They'd say the animal would encounter a stimulus, and the stimulus would produce a response, and then the responses would get chained together, and then when the animal encountered the stimulus again, then just those chained responses would automatically run. And one of the famous experiments that showed that that was wrong was a rat was trained to run through a maze. You can sort of train a rat pretty quickly if, you know, you put him in the maze and there's like, he can go this way or this way, and you put some cheese over here. And you do that 3 or 4 times, the rat learns to turn right. And then you add another piece to the maze, and, you know, then the rat learns to turn left, and so you can get it turning, you know, in an extremely complicated way to walk through the maze. But then what they did was they took a rat, and they wrapped up its hind legs, you know, like with tape, so it couldn't use them, and then they put its little rear end on a cart, and then they had the little rat scoot through the maze on the cart. And it's obvious that a scooting rat and a running rat don't use the same motor output, not even close, and the rat could still get through the maze. So the idea that all the rat had done was chain together learned automatic responses turned out to be wrong. Rats, it's more like rats learn what's going on and can generalize from it just like you do. So anyway, so the notion that the drive just instantiates a sequence of pre-programmed behaviors, in most cases, in many cases, especially with complex behavior, turns out to be wrong. There's some limited circumstances under which it's right. Okay, so the first hypothesis we're going to entertain is the idea that you have to frame the world in order to interact with it. And this is sort of a little mythological diagram that I whipped up a long time ago. And the bottom thing, that's an Ouroboros, by the way, which is a dragon that eats its own tail. It's an ancient symbol of chaos. And chaos is what you see when you don't know what you're looking at. And so you could say, in some sense, chaos is all the complexity that surrounds you that could possibly intrude on your little safe world. And then to grasp that chaos or to operate within it, you have to put it within a framework. And so that's the great father there. That's actually God. You see, and God's got the sun behind him because God is like the sun. He's, you know, reliable, and he's associated with consciousness, and then he's sort of ruling over this city. And so for me, that was a good symbol of culture. And in part, culture is what's outside of you. But in part, culture is also the frameworks that you've learned to use by being with other people. The frameworks that you've learned to use to narrow and specify the world. And in my mode of thinking, the framing is associated with security on the one hand, because it tells you what you can do and, you know, makes things safe for you, and tyranny on the other hand, because it can get out of control and, you know, it can start to get too rigid. Whatever. Regardless of the pros and cons of framing, if you see something one way, then you can't see it another. It's harder to see it another. So that's the con side of framing. The pros side of framing is, well, then you get to do something. If it's unframed, you're in chaos. It's existential anxiety. You're not going to move ahead at all. So you have to frame things. You have to simplify them. And really, in some sense, you even have to oversimplify them. It depends on what you mean by that. But what you're really trying to do is to never make your perceptual task any more complex than it has to be in order to get done what you need to get done. So, how do you frame things? Well, the first thing we should point out is that a lot of framing doesn't even happen psychologically. Right? So here you are sitting in this classroom, and you're not overwhelmed by chaos. Well, why? Well, first of all, you're in a city. That's helpful. There's electricity here, and there's natural gas, and there's people to fix all the plumbing. And so the fact that you're in a city makes life much simpler right off the bat. There's nothing trying to eat you. You don't have to contend with the fact that it's like minus 20 for 3 months. And, you know, so that's a whole bunch of complexity that the civilized world has just taken care of for you. And then, you know, now you're in the university in the city, and that eliminates a whole bunch of other hassles, you know. There's some things you have to do, but there's a bunch of things you don't have to do, and then you're inside this building, and wow, look at that. There's electric light here, and, you know, and the chairs work, and there's not going to be an earthquake, and probably the whole building isn't going to fall down. So, you know, by the time you're sitting in your chair here, also with your clothing on, you've screened a lot of complexity out already, and so you can sit there fairly calmly. And so that's all external. Now, part of the reason, and this is worth thinking about, because this isn't only psychological. You guys will hear a fair bit about terror management theories as you progress through your education. And so terror management theories are theories that attempt to account for why people are, say, patriotic in their beliefs, why they adopt belief systems. And the idea is that a belief system protects you from death anxiety. And so Freud sort of said that about religious systems. That was his critique of religion. People are afraid of death, and so they have this infantile desire to have that fear go away, so they turn to religion, and religion says, well, death isn't permanent, and that's why people are religious. And the extension of that is, well, that's also why they have belief systems in general. They're trying to protect themselves against this deep, shaking anxiety. And to some degree, I suspect that's true. But you should also remember that when you're protecting your culture, say, if you identify with it, you're patriotic or whatever it is, or you think that your culture is worth defending, you're not just defending something psychological. It's like the culture, the functioning culture keeps the lights on. You know, so it doesn't just protect you from death anxiety. It also protects you from death. And that's even more important most of the time than being protected from death anxiety. Now, there's a psychological component to it too, but you don't ever want to underestimate just the practical utility of being nested inside, you know, what Piaget would consider a relatively functional game. It's like your world's a lot simpler. You know, you have to work to maintain it and everything, and that's kind of a drag maybe. That's the tyrannical element of it, but, you know, the payoff's pretty big. Okay, so if you look at medieval cities, this is a well-preserved medieval city in France. There's a lot of medieval cities that still exist in Europe. And you see, this is a typical sort of human habitation. It's like inside there's order, and outside there's chaos and barbarians, and then there's a couple of walls to keep the chaos and the barbarians out, and then inside, you know, there's a dominance hierarchy and everybody can live their relatively productive and relatively peaceful lives inside of that. It's all framing, getting rid of complexity, unnecessary complexity. Same thing with houses, they do the same thing for you. And then social institutions do the same thing too. It's like, okay, this is it Kennedy there and Obama? I think so. This is part of the transition in power from George Bush to Obama. And, you know, that's a pretty scary thing to have the leader of your dominance hierarchy replaced by another leader. And, you know, among chimpanzees, for example, that's often the occasion for a fair bit of mayhem. And it's also the case often for people that occurs. And, you know, we still have that in the form of political corruption and so on. But all things considered, you know, the power transition from Obama, or from Bush to Obama, was far more peaceful than such power transitions generally are if you look across the history of mankind. And so that means you're also protected by your social institutions. They screen out a lot of potential complexity as well, as long as they're functional, and also I think as long as they follow some of the Piagetian rules. And so one of the Piagetian rules for a playable game is there's some reciprocity. You know, you regard the system, roughly speaking, as either fair or fairer than any other system you can think up. You know, it boils down to the same thing, because if it's not fair but you can't come up with a better fantasy, well, it's as good as it can be. So the sociological or sociopolitical structures that keep complexity away from us can only operate under a certain limited number of constraints, but still they perform their function, you know, and very admirably. It's amazing, I think, because I see people in my clinical practice all the time, you know, and most people that I see, and I think this is true of most people in the world, have at least one serious problem. You know, and it might be they have an illness that's just god-awful, or if they don't have an illness, one of their immediate family has an illness that's god-awful, or they're really old and they need to be taken care of, or they're suffering from some insane economic problem, or they've just been unemployed, or whatever. You know, there's something in their immediate circle that's really, really difficult to grapple with, and yet people still go out and maintain their place in the world, and the whole thing roughly works. And to me, that's just a continual source of amazement that people can pull that off, you know. So anyway, so a lot of the screening that you do to get rid of that complexity is external, and part of that is a consequence of good, well-functioning sociological organization. Then the next thing that sort of screens things out for you is your body, right? Now look, you kind of naturally see things at a particular level of resolution, right? There's no obvious reason why that should be. So, you know, you see the front of people, you can't see the back of them. You see their external covering, their skin and their clothes. You can't see inside them. When you look closely at them, you can't see their cellular structure or their molecular structure or their atomic structure. You can't really see the social situations that they're embedded in. So if I look at you, I can't see your family. I presume you have one. I can't really see the political situation that surrounds you either. I have to know that abstractly, and then the ecological level is almost completely imperceptible to me. And so part of the way that complexity is screened out is that your body just doesn't allow you to pick a lot of it up. You're just blind to it. So you see at one level of resolution, and that's the human level. You see things of approximately our size. You see things that are approximately the size that we can grip. Those are sort of the things that you're likely to think of as objects. Like clearly a mountain isn't exactly an object, you know, so usability is part of what defines perceptibility. And so that also screens things out. And so then you're left with, well, what it is that you have to deal with once everything's been screened out. And then you might ask, well, there's still a lot of complexity left there. Like there's plenty of complexity within the average family. And there's plenty of complexity in the mating domain, you know, to find a partner and to establish a reasonable long-term relationship and to have children and to raise them. There's plenty of complexity left. And then the question is, how